It's been described as one of New York City's most notorious killings. The body of a young girl found stuffed in a picnic cooler along the Henry Hudson Parkway in Manhattan. For 22 years, the case went unsolved until a tip led to a suspect, which led to a confession. But to get a conviction, the district attorney's office says they need the testimony of a New York Times reporter.
No one ever reported a baby missing. No one ever gave police a solid lead. Then in 2013, a tip led to a suspect.
Detectives from the Bronx Violent Felony Squad apprehended Conrado Juarez.
Finally, Baby Hope, as she was dubbed, had a name, Angelica Castillo. And the man charged with her rape and murder was a much older cousin, Conrado Juarez. Once in custody, he confessed.
The justice is going to be when some judge lowers his gavel and says, you're going to jail for the rest of your life.
But 5 years later, there is still no conviction because just days after his arrest, during a jailhouse interview, he told New York Times reporter Francis Robles that the confession was coerced. Prosecutors have been trying to force Robles to turn over her notes, saying the evidence is critical to the case. The New York State Court of Appeals is the final stop and will soon rule on whether Robles can be forced to testify and forced to turn over her notes.
Well, Dan, you're a student of these kinds of things. I don't understand why they can't proceed with the original evidence, and including the confession. You know, this could be an interesting sidebar. Oh, by the way, he claims it was coerced. Why is that so critical to this case? Even though he did, by the way, fill in a lot of details.
Right.
The same details that he gave the police, he gave to Francis Robles. But why can't they proceed with the prosecution?
Well, of course, that would be the New York Times lawyer's argument. Yeah. Why can't you proceed with this without having our reporter testify? I mean, unfortunately, this case is a reminder that reporters have a fairly limited ability to protect their sources under the law. New York State has a shield law, but the shield law does say that if a reporter has information that is absolutely crucial to a case and there's no other way you can get it, then the reporter can be compelled to testify.
She's not protecting a source, so I'm wondering what the big deal is here. She's not protecting anybody.
That's right, and when you are trying to keep yourself from having to testify in something where you're not protecting a source, your ability to do that is even lower. The courts generally recognize protecting an anonymous source as a higher interest than what she's trying to do in this case. So even though you and I might think that the prosecution can certainly go ahead with this case without forcing her to testify, obviously the prosecution would like to hear from her, and it'll be up to a judge to decide whether she has to or not.
I think to your point of what they would want, what they could gain from this, I mean, oftentimes, you know, you might be having, I've had interviews with people who went back and forth on a certain issue, and so perhaps you could see that there's a pattern of this person admitting that they did it and then say, well, no, I didn't. Well, actually, I did. And then she ended up going with the final version, which was that this person said they were coerced. I don't know. I'm just sort of a hypothetical situation here. But I think that's the reason they want to look at what is the context that you arrived at this conclusion for your story? Is there something more that we should be aware of? But at the same time, I found this to be a little odd because usually when courts or prosecutors or you know, law enforcement officials are trying to get information from reporters, it typically is, we don't know who did this, and we heard that they told you about it, and so we want to get more information so we can go after them. And so this one seems as if they have all the information that they need to prosecute, and they're just fishing to see if there's anything else out there.
I was talking about this with our producer, Antonio Caban. We were both trying to wrap our brain around what it was that prosecutors want that they don't have. And here's sort of where we came down. Right now, he gave one narrative to prosecutors in which he said, I killed the girl and then I helped dispose of her body. He gave an alternate narrative to the New York Times in which he said, I didn't kill her, but I helped dispose of the body. And basically, the prosecutors seem to want as much of that alternate narrative as they can get so they can poke holes in it. We already know from the Times' follow-up that there are parts of that alternate narrative in which his confession was coerced that don't really hold up. For example, he says he learned the girl was killed when he got a call on his cell phone. But as the reporter pointed out in her story at the time, 3% of Americans had cell phones in that year. It's highly unlikely that he would have been one of them. But I think they basically just want as much raw material as they can work with to say this other thing he now says happened, it doesn't pass the smell test.
So there's a couple things that I noted here. First of all, Frances Robles is a very, very, very good reporter, and she's a very, very good investigative reporter with many, many details that I'm sure they would like. The other thing I would point out, too, is that the guy in question is Latino, as is she. And I believe that she made the kind of rapport that she often does with her subjects, and he felt comfortable to tell her something, and that's what they want. Because they feel like the real story he shared with her because he felt comfortable to do that. On the other hand, this is just some bogus stuff to try to get more information because she's so good. One of the reasons she's so good is she's very detailed about, so there's a lot of stuff I'm sure that she has that she did not put in the story, but her pattern would be to have gathered all the rest of this other stuff. So this is just some bogus stuff to break down this the wall that we have and the protection that journalists have on information that they could get otherwise.
What's the current, conventional wisdom about whether we keep our notes or get rid of them? Because I tend to recycle my notebooks, and I'm not usually dealing with stuff this
different lawyers give different advice,
right.
actually.
And I'm not sure what some of it. Remember, we just did that story how many months ago where the person had kept the notes for 10 years.
Oh yeah.
Right.
So you know.
I like keeping notes.
If I have a
because
computer, they're on that computer. But, but if I'm in court,
well, those little notebooks, I have stacks and stacks of those,
Yeah.
and I like them because there are times where if they came to you, you could say, well, no, in fact, here is what I had. So you can use it to back up your story even further. And so for that reason, I've always kept
typically, they're
them.
not trying to get something they don't already, to Emily's original point, they already have. They're just trying to get more. That's what they're trying to do.
But there's another aspect to this. I'm not sure whether this figures into it or not. But if the prosecution simply wants to introduce her story into evidence, you really can't do that unless you give the defense lawyer a chance to cross-examine her.